So I know you guys are, looking at sort of your total audience measurement, being able to sort of reach, have as much reach as you can in that consistent currency. Tell me a little bit about what you're hearing from, this sort of large digital only publishers today, what their business needs are, the traditional guys that are coming online with force. What's keeping people up at night right now?
So, multi-platform would have to be the number one challenge, and how to measure the unduplicated audiences across all these platforms, as well as the audience within each of the platforms. I'd say that's the biggest issue that the people are facing. Back to your opening comment about currency, I think the issue in digital is very different, though, from television, right? I mean, it's not third-party data that's really the currency in digital. I mean, you've got the ad servers that are doing the counting of impressions, whereas in television, you really don't have that, and so you have to rely on a panel. So it's a very, very different situation. I think where the data is beginning to have an impact from a currency perspective in digital, though, is that as the issue of viewability and fraud has emerged, then you start to not to be able to rely just on the ad server to give you the true validated number of impressions. And so that third-party data becomes then a part of the currency discussion, which I think is certainly good for the third-party data providers. And I think that's an issue that this issue of viewability and fraud is something that I think everybody's wrestling with, and both the buyers and the sellers. And I think we're finally making a lot of progress in that regard.
Tell me a little about the progress you think we're making there in regards to.
So I think that when that 3MS initiative, came out, which is the IAB, the 4As, and the ANA, and they said, look, we have to be able to measure the exposure and the delivery of these ads, which is really, are we reaching the target that was intended? And then we have to be able to measure whether or not the ad was in view.
Right. That
opened up, from my perspective at least, the spotlight on fraud, finally. I think it's something that the industry was just, I don't think, willing to address before. So I think 3MS made fraud an issue in a positive sense. It also made viewability outside of the fraud issue a focus. It made whether or not the buyer was receiving the targeting accuracy that the seller was telling them an issue. And just like any transition or change in an industry, I think it was problematic at first. I think the publishers were struggling with the issue of having to guarantee audiences. But I think it's come a long way, and I think it's well on its way to being a positive for the industry.
And if we talk about programmatic from the context of creating marketplaces and aggregating inventory across multiple publishers at much higher volumes, does that aggregation of inventory result in a greater propensity for fraud to sort of be, rampant? I mean, it feels like that's the eventuality, because direct sales, specifically from direct publishers, is the sales channel that we see the least amount of fraud historically, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that's certainly what we see with our data, that the viewability levels are significantly higher on the premium publishers than they are on the exchanges, if you will. So the further you get onto the tail, the bigger the challenge of fraud. So we've tried to address that with a number of products that are providing the viewability measure and separating out the fraud issue, right? So was the ad seen by a bot as opposed to a human? That's part of the viewability problem, but instead of the fraud label, separate from the issue, the impression was delivered against a computer that had a human being behind it, but for whatever reason, that impression was never seen. So those are two issues. So what we found is that it's pretty clear that the lower viewability levels on the tail, or the middle and the tail, really trace in large part to fraud. Fraud is much higher there than it is on the premium publishers. So just this week, we introduced a product that's focused on the programmatic buy, that is aimed at providing more confidence in that buy that you're actually going to get what you think you're getting.
So that's a focus on mid-long tail, if you to use your construct.
It's a focus on the entire set of sites that a programmatic buy, an audience buy that's bought programmatically could land on. And so trying to give the buyer more confidence, as well as tools for the seller, that will increase the likelihood that that programmatic buy will turn out to be what you want it to be.
So, I mean, I struggle with the ROI, if we go back to sort of use the language we were yesterday, right, in an omnipotent currency, right, that can do all those things, can define, can ensure that we have full ubiquitous measurement of an audience, full ubiquitous measurement of a campaign, can ensure that an ad was seen, an ad was delivered. Like, I'm really trying to, the business impact operationally from a revenue recognition perspective, from how we account for revenue, like all of that is the industry, it's what it's asking for, and it's what it's hammering you and your brethren for on the measurement side of the business. But do you think they're ready for it?
Yeah, I don't worry about that issue. I worry, if I was a seller of advertising, let me put it that way, if I was a seller of advertising, I would worry more about whether the ad was having an impact on the consumer that the buyer was expecting it to be. Mm-hmm. And when you get into that, it's not just a media issue, you got a whole creative issue there as to whether or not the ad is having an impact. I remember somebody told me early in my career, they said, listen, you can put as much weight as you want behind an ineffective ad, and 6 times 0 is still 0.
Right.
And so, you've got to worry about the creative part of it, which I don't think the digital industry is really focused on to the degree that is warranted.
Right.
Just my personal feeling. Another issue, though, that could come up here that I think is more troublesome is the following, all right? The faster you read all of this stuff, mm-hmm. in terms of its impact, the possibility exists that what you end up reading is price and promotion impact, as opposed to the impact of an ad in a creative sense, right? And the reason I worry about that is I lived through it before ComScore. I was running a company by the name of IRI, Information Resources, and we were the first company to harness scanner data, right? And everybody thought, boy, now once you get that scanner data and you're able to read sales in almost real time with real granularity, it's going to be fantastic. Well, what happened is that the split of advertising and promotion in CPG, in the CPG industry, went from 70% advertising, 30% promotion, to the opposite.
Flipped.
Right?
Yep.
Now, but they spent more money. All right, so the advertiser, the Procter & Gamble and Kraft, spent more money to the tune of about, I think it was like $40 billion a year more, but it all went into case allowances and trade deals, which then got passed along, some of it, to the consumers in terms of price. So one of the issues that I think we need to worry about, and I think this is where there could be some very positive pressure on creative, is the faster we deliver and measure and read all of this stuff, the possibility exists that will actually cause the advertiser to put more money into price and promotion rather than advertising, if they find that the advertising that's really moving the needle is simply the communication of price and promotion incentives.
So this is an interesting question. I want to sort of pose it to you and then turn it out to conversation. So this begs, measurement, its greatest value. If we look at ROI, and again, I'm gonna level set that when I say ROI this morning, I'm referring to the creation of real economic value that is measurable, right? So is the greatest ROI in measurement, do you think, for publishers in the realization of sort of net new revenue in advertising? Or is it, for example, in undermining, untapped revenue? It's not necessarily spend, but in understanding the effectiveness of advertising, or with publishers, allowing them to better distribute content and to monetize that better, perhaps upstream on the subscriber base, or if they're broadcasters, on the traditional legacy distribution side of the business. Like, I mean, because those optics may change the way we look at measurement, right?
Yeah, to some degree. I think if you look at the numbers and take total ad spending over the past, decade, there's no evidence that TV ad spending has dropped. Yes, the viewing has gotten fragmented and so on, but the total dollar spent hasn't gone down, right? Digital has skyrocketed. It's still growing at 15%.
But to your point, from a base of zero, that's...
Yeah, but it's coming from other budgets, I think. And if you look at, because the total amount of money spent on advertising in the US, it's not like that's growing, it's not growing at consistently at 10%.
Right.
Right? And so there's been a shift of platforms, I think, and certainly print has gotten hammered. And I suspect that what the publishers are getting are ad dollars that are shifting from one platform to another, from print to digital,
Okay.
in large part. So, yeah, it's, if you were a print publisher before and now you've got print and digital, you know, you're in a very different situation than somebody who came along who didn't exist in the print world. You know, a Yahoo or an AOL would be an example of that, right? That's a new publisher. I think their situation is very different from the one that a combination print and digital publisher faces. But I think that, going back to your opening monologue, one of the issues here is whether the pie is expanding at the rate that we'd all like to see it. And I think, you know, the evidence is that ad spending is under more pressure than we would all like to see. Why? You could argue maybe the evidence isn't there yet that it works as well as we would like. Maybe there's not enough focus on creative. Maybe the advertiser is under such pressure themselves that they are putting then pressure on the entire ecosystem. There's one other issue that I think comes into play here that we have to recognize, which is that I like to say that the internet has put pricing power in the hands of the consumer in a way that we've never seen before, right? I mean, if you want to find the lowest price for any product today, you can just go, you know, one of the comparison shopping sites and, you know, and do it. And so there's real pressure, I think, on the prices being paid by the consumer, which then translates to real pressure on the advertiser and the manufacturer, which then translates into real pressure on the agencies, and then it's real pressure on the publishers, you know, in the medium. So we're in I think we're in a challenging environment, and maybe that's going to be the renaissance of creative. I mean, I like to think that it could be. There's going to put more pressure on coming up with advertising that persuades a consumer to pay a premium price for a brand that they value enough. That's hopefully is what's going to happen.
Okay.